Welcome to Ask a Catholic Therapist Anything. Today's question comes from Melissa in Ohio. She says, "Hi, Amber. I keep hearing the word narcissist everywhere online. To be honest, I've started wondering if my husband might be one. We've been married for over 10 years, and while he's a good dad and provider, I often feel like he doesn't really listen to me or that my feelings get brushed off. When we argue, he can come across as very self-focused, and afterwards, I'll see something online about narcissistic behavior and think, that is him. I don't want to be unfairly labeling him, but I also don't want to keep excusing harmful behavior if it's really something bigger. Is it possible he's a narcissist? How can I even know? And if not, then how do I make sense of these moments where I feel so unseen?" First, it's important to say that I can't diagnose your husband, and my suggestion would be that you not try to either. Diagnoses require careful professional evaluation over time. When we're in close personal relationships, it's even harder to see the dynamics clearly. So instead of diagnosing, let's unpack the bigger picture together. In the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right now we're on the 5TR, it has all of the different diagnoses that we can give as mental health practitioners. And it gives us information about them as well as the diagnostic criteria. When we're studying to be mental health practitioners, we take entire courses on how to diagnose accurately, and it's often not as easy as it seems. Narcissistic personality disorder is in a category called personality disorders. So let's look at that first. The DSM describes a personality disorder as enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are inflexible, stable over time, and cause significant distress or impairment. The DSM groups personality disorders, of which there are 10 defined, into 3 different clusters, A, B, and C. Cluster A is the paranoid, schizoid, or schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster B is the antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. Cluster C is the avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders, not to be confused with obsessive compulsive disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder is just one of 10 possible personality disorders, and even within cluster B, it's not the most common. So if we just look at the data, chances are your husband's not a narcissist. The data shows that narcissistic personality disorder affects 1 to 6% of the population, depending on this study. The National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Disorders found a 6.2% lifetime prevalence, while other studies suggest just 1 to 2% of the people who do have personality disorders. Research tells us that 50 to 75% are men. That still means that most husbands likely don't have all of diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. That said, I want to turn gently to this feeling that we may have in the need to diagnose. When we feel hurt or unseen in relationships, it can be really tempting to reach out for a diagnosis to explain it. And if we're looking to find a diagnosis because we hope that if a diagnosis is found, then you know how to solve a problem, that's certainly understandable. But other times, this urge can come from a deep need to be validated. If my husband has narcissism, then what I feel is real. And here's the thing, whether your husband has NPD or not, your feelings are still real and your hurt is valid. If your spouse does not have NPD, it doesn't mean that you aren't experiencing painful or harmful behavior. Diagnosis is not required for your hurt to be validated or to matter. There are very strict guidelines for what it takes to have a diagnosable narcissistic personality disorder. But let's talk about some of the things that often get confused with narcissism but aren't. Like immaturity or poor emotion regulation, social awkwardness that can come off as being self-focused, work stress or depression that makes someone withdraw, cultural factors that emphasize independence or toughness, and sometimes it's also our own filters. For example, if we feel secure, we may interpret normal self-confidence as arrogance or an inflated sense of self. I'd also like to say a word about the term gaslighting, which was not in your question, but I often see these two terms together. Gaslighting is real. It does happen, but I think it's really important not to over-pathologize. For gaslighting to be gaslighting, which, by the way, is not actually a clinical term, it does have to be intentional. If whenever we're having an argument with our spouse and they're saying that our point of view is not true, that their point of view is true, if they're not intentionally trying to lie to you, it can feel like gaslighting, but might not be. It's also important to know that all of us have a certain amount of selfishness. It's concupiscence. It's what happened in the fall. And part of our journey as Christians is to turn that selfishness into virtue. Just because someone exhibits selfish behavior, it doesn't automatically make them a narcissist. What we feel like might be narcissism is actually something else, or the momentary behavior, not a pervasive. There has been a boom on social media for the word narcissist. If you search certain channels by their most seen videos, a lot of time anxiety or narcissism will come up on top. The language of narcissism has exploded online in TikTok, Instagram, and pop psychology blogs. There was a study that found mentions of the word narcissist in online searches and media articles have more than tripled in the last decade. This can be validating at first, but it also inflates the term until it gets applied far more broadly than the true disorder. Sometimes I see the word narcissistic as an adjective used in place of the term narcissistic personality disorder. In pop psych or online, when you hear the word narcissistic, it's usually a synonym for selfish, rude, or just being a jerk. So this can leave people labeling normal conflicts as narcissistic abuse. I certainly do not deny that narcissistic personality disorder exists. Is it possible that your husband has NPD? It is. Is it possible that you are enduring narcissistic abuse? Statistically, it would be rare, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. If you ever feel unsafe in your marriage, it's important to take steps to protect yourself physically and emotionally. True narcissistic personality disorder has to be evaluated and diagnosed by a licensed clinician and generally can't be done after one meeting or even one battery of tests. Ethical therapists who diagnose personality disorders are often cautious before they push the button. We look for behaviors over long periods of time. It's something you grow to be aware of or to see and diagnose in your client. I also know that after you have a really difficult argument with your spouse and you go online, see an Instagram, like you said, with a trait or an example of something he might have done, and maybe even somebody who says they're a therapist says this is narcissism, and we have to be very self-aware. It can be really self-validating and help us lick our emotional wounds to have someone else who has some credibility saying, hey, this person's wrong, this person's bad. And I think it's important to recognize if that's happening and be more thoughtful about how we're framing it. The other issue is diagnosis was never meant to be a weapon. And I'm certainly not saying that you're thinking about it that way. But if we're speaking about this in general terms, I do think sometimes that some people want a diagnosis to be used as a weapon to say, oh, he's a narcissist, meaning he's bad. And if we look at this in Gottman terms or in emotion-focused therapy terms, as soon as we start seeing our partner as the enemy or our partner as the problem, rather than the problem being the problem or the dynamic between the two of us being the problem, then that shifts us out of the social engagement mode into the courtroom, so to speak, where we want to plead our case to say who's right and who's wrong. And this kind of thinking is never helpful in marriage. So diagnosis is used as a descriptor and as a way to communicate information quickly to other mental health professionals. I appreciate you let me going into all of the different possibilities because you're certainly not the only one who is wondering about this or experiencing this or having these questions. So what might be a healthier way to interact or to solve this problem or question about if your husband is a narcissist? Instead of saying he's a narcissist or could he be a narcissist, it might be more helpful to try to describe the behavior that you don't like. So instead of he's a narcissist, you could say, when he minimizes my feelings, I feel small and unseen. Or instead of she's toxic, you could try, when she interrupts me, I feel disrespected. Naming behaviors then keeps the focus on what we can change rather than locking someone's total identity under a clinical label. But even if someone does have narcissistic personality disorder, remember that diagnosis itself comes from somewhere. Research suggests that NPD can come from a mix of early childhood environment, trauma, neglect, or inconsistent parenting. And so underneath the grandiosity is often a fragile self-esteem, shame, and very deep wounds. This doesn't excuse hurtful behavior because as adults, I absolutely believe that while we influence one another, we're all responsible for our own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But as Catholics, we're also invited to see even those who harm us as people loved by God, struggling in ways that we might not even be able to see. This is not me saying not to set boundaries. It's super important to set boundaries when there is emotionally destructive behavior, whether it comes from narcissistic personality disorder or something else. But remember that someone who does have NPD is often struggling with some really deep wounds. And I think there is a fear that in relationships, if we start labeling our spouse as anything, whether it's he's a narcissist or he's selfish or he's immature or he's a bad cook, that In a certain way, it can feel good in the moment and validate your pain, but long term, it can actually harden resentment and close the door to true healing. Our brains are also prone to confirmation bias. So if you believe something about someone, your brain's more likely to see those behaviors and confirm the thing that you already think. So what might be a Catholic response? I think it's twofold. One, there's truth in love and boundaries. You can recognize harmful behaviors, set boundaries, seek counseling, and if necessary, protect yourself and your children. And then the flip side of that is compassion and redemption. To remember that for all of us, even those with personality disorders, are not defined by labels, but by our identity as children of God. Healing is possible. It can be very hard and a long road, especially with personalities, but healing is possible, though not always within the relationship itself. Unfortunately, it takes two people to make a marriage work and one to break it. And we have to respect the validity of the sacrament of marriage, but that doesn't mean you have to stay in the same room or under the same roof as someone who is abusing you. Some helpful resources might be the Boundaries books by Dr. Cloud and Townsend. They have an entire series and they're all wonderful. Spiritual direction, counseling from Catholic therapists who integrate faith and psychology, not from online influencers who sensationalize mental health labels to get clicks and views. So is your husband a narcissist? Probably not. The real question is, what is his behavior and how is it impacting you? When we shift from labeling to describing, we open the door for clarity, to communication, and to healing. And as Catholics, we remember that every person, even in their brokenness, is loved by God. This doesn't mean to ignore or to not set boundaries for bad or abusive behavior. It just means to make sure that we're leaving diagnosis in the hands of people who are equipped to diagnose, and then also challenge our thoughts about why we feel like we might need a diagnosis and what that means. Thank you for writing in, Melissa. I'm sure this is a question that many people are going to resonate with. If you would like to submit a question for Ask a Catholic Therapist Anything, remember there's a link in the description for the anonymous form. We'll see you next time.